Come on, let's go!
For many years now, we on this channel have been on the quest to recover DreamWorks' long-lost would-be masterpiece, Me and My Shadow, easily out of all of the cancelled DreamWorks projects we've covered over on the Cancelled series. And boy, there are a lot of these. This is the one that always seemed to have so much potential. Using shadows to combine traditional 2D and modern 3D animation in such a seamless way would have been so fantastic to have seen pulled off in an actual movie. It would have been like the first DreamWorks production to feature traditional animation since Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas in 2003. But never mind, they gave us Sheldon as an actual alien whilst Rihanna watches on instead. Remember that forgettable era of DreamWorks? Bit of an oxymoron, I guess. Specifically, it was actually Mr. Peabody and Sherman that ultimately took the Me and My Shadow spot, followed by Kung Fu Panda 3 taking the spot it moved to. By which point, it was apparent that this movie wasn't happening. Apparently, we have top DreamWorks mogul Mr. Jeffrey Katzenberg to thank for that one, who even apparently fell asleep during a screening of it. And yet, that hasn't stopped artifacts of lost media from this project rising to the surface over the years. I mean, same time last year, we covered new footage that spilled out online. And each ongoing year, it feels like we really are learning more and more about it, inevitably raising the question of whether this project is about to be resurrected. It wouldn't be the first time this has happened, just look at the now Oscar-nominated Nimona. That was thought to have gone down with the good ship Blue Sky Studios when they were bought out by Disney, and look what happened to that after it had been cancelled. This is a tad different, as it's still with the same studio, however there is precedent for these movies being resurrected long after they've been supposedly cancelled. I mean, there was a similar story with The Croods. The Croods was a redeveloped version of cancelled Aardman co-production Crude Awakening, so DreamWorks have dabbled with this before. However, with all the information we now have, can we piece together what the story was going to be? Can we put a movie together chronologically, or at least half of it, that we have available in bits and pieces? Well, that's what I'm going to try and do right now. This video script was also held alongside members of the Me and My Shadow Discord server. So if you're interested in being in with the community of Me and My Shadow, consider joining on that Discord server. They also show off any kind of clips as they get revealed by the zeitgeist of the internet. Thank you to specifically members Shadis and Squidward15 for helping fine-tune the smaller details, making sure I got everything right. And with that, let's officially begin. Let's start with the opening. We actually do have a couple things to start off with. We'll start with the definitely fan-made version for the opening titles, including the DreamWorks logo. Alternatively, I could have also imagined the whole logo being a shadow on a wall or something. A bit like how it was on that nursery thing in The Boss Baby, which honestly is probably the closest to creative flair that movie had. I was also going to suggest a more slapstick sequence where the shadow climbs up the Moon Boy's fishing rod and attacks him, but then I remembered that this would be coming from the water, so maybe it'd be more of a reflection and not a shadow. Me and My Reflection sounds more like a meditation book, or that Mulan song. Regardless, the sequence we do get following this in the fan edit gives off a similar vibe to the Monsters Inc. opening credits in some ways, however more subdued. We also have actual production footage of what could be an opening sequence, but what also is potentially just a teaser trailer / proof of concept. Using particularly stylized 2D animation, we have glimpses of both our main character Daniel's shadow, called Dan of course, and what is most likely the villain of the piece before going to the title card. Considering the whole plot revolves around Shadow Dan witnessing a crime, you can see that coming across in the visuals, despite it not coming into the plot until later. We see both Dan looking horrified and a genuinely creepy villain design, which kinda reminds me of what DreamWorks would go on to do with the wolf in Puss in Boots 2. I mean, there's literally multiple times that guy turns up as a shadow, so I can see how that idea may have been recycled in that movie. It also sort of reminds me of the villains in the opening of Batman the Animated Series. Kinda fitting, as this gives us way more vibes of a TV intro rather than a movie's. Regardless, I could see this working as an opening, even foreshadowing the incriminating event early doors. In either scenario, we would have then gone on to what I call the classic day in the life kind of world-building status quo.
Here's my Daniel. Just doing his job as usual.
We follow the protagonist going through the motions of their day, whilst the wacky quirks of the world are used as a series of mini gags before the inciting incident comes in to shake things up at the end. A lot of animated movies have this, particularly Pixar movies that seems to introduce a new, elaborate alternate universe every single time. In Monsters Inc., it's Mike and Sully going to work. In Finding Nemo, it's Marlin taking Nemo to school. In the Lego Movie, it's Emmett's day at work to the sound of a particularly catchy tune we don't need to be playing right now. And in Me Me and My Shadow, this would have likely followed our main character Daniel Grubb going about his day along with the rest of the humans, whilst the shadows are doing all kinds of hilarious shenanigans, quite literally, behind their backs. That would make the most sense anyway. We've got footage of Dan doing this without Daniel noticing, so it checks out. We also know that this whole opening sequence would have been narrated by Shadow Dan in a way I'm sure would initially mislead the audience to thinking it was Daniel.
Possibly the most tedious job in the world. Oh, I don't mean his. Mine. Yes, that's me. Well, that's for you to decide.
Those dreams,
Shadow Dan has to follow Daniel's daily routine as well, and is clearly fairly bored of it. Having seen the average Joe lives out his boring life sequence a million times, it certainly would have been a refreshing way to approach this. Daniel Grubb lives a typical run-of-the-mill working life, checking light bulbs, always living by the rules and sticking to his bulb-checking routine, and generally keeping himself out of the way of others.
You know, he's kind of a average, normal kind of guy.
With movies like Shaun of the Dead, Free Guy, and indeed the Lego Movie, we've seen this awkward everyman archetype play out several times. However, Daniel's overly cautious, introverted qualities would have been more unique to him and very relatable to a lot of us. That awkwardness you feel walking past a police officer when you've done absolutely nothing wrong, or leaving a shop without paying for anything, that's what I can imagine seeing encapsulated by this character. He's not just following an everyday lifestyle, he's actively afraid of not doing so. Considering this character is the polar opposite to the more happy-go-lucky and outgoing Olaf, it would have certainly been an interesting role for Josh Gad, who was set to star as Daniel. From footage of him at work as well, he seems pretty complacent with his simplistic job. On the surface, anyway. The complete opposite within this movie, however, is his shadow, Dan, who absolutely does not vibe with it. However, unfortunately for him, Daniel's job is something along the lines of testing light bulbs in a dark-looking room, meaning old Shadow Dan has to stick around quite often. This would have made up maybe the first 5 to 6 minutes of the movie full of shenanigans of Daniel getting himself into awkward situations with co-workers, including the obligatory embarrassing encounter with the office manager. Presumably, this atypical sequence would have been underpinned by gags with the shadows in some ways, and not just Daniel's. Perhaps even full interactions in the human world being contrasted with the shadows. I'm envisioning an office chat around a water cooler, then panning down to the shadows having a completely separate conversation, because that's the world of this movie. There is a whole separate realm for the shadows called the Shadow World. They are generally connected to the people they belong to, but they are absolutely their own being as well. They have their own separate lives and personalities in the Shadow World, which, from the footage we have, seems to be completely separate from just what humans are able to see in their world. It's not just the shadows of buildings and vehicles on the sidewalk, it's a sort of parallel universe of where the shadows go when they're not being cast. However, when they're needed in the human world, they have to be there. And so we have a scenario where Daniel may be the one with the straightforward job that is typical of trapped protagonists like this, but it's his shadow who's the one who feels limited by it. Honestly, kind of a 90s premise, you know? The sort of bored office guy archetype is very emblematic of Fight Club eras of movies, and having a character trying to blast out of their little cubicle is very emblematic of that time rather than 2016. Interesting to think about. Later in the movie, there would have been a revelation that in fact Dan does literally reflect what Daniel actually wants from life deep down. So there is clearly a connection between Shadow and Caster. The closest we really have of that up front is Dan regularly mentioning and idolizing an action movie character called Jack Shade, who he mentions a couple of times, has posters and a cardboard cutout of, and clearly wants to be more like. Coming up, the movie does show a common compassionate quality of the two characters unwittingly sharing the moment together, as despite their differences, we do have a sequence with a cat, with both Daniel petting the actual cat and Shadow Dan petting the shadow cat whilst on the bed.
Good job, everybody.
You too, you little kitty cat with your wiggy wig.
Hey, what's the whiskers, mate?
As for clocking out for Shadow Dan, it doesn't come from the end of the work shift, but from leaving the world of light entirely at the end of the day. Before the confrontation kicks in, then seemingly being transported, better than all after the cat thing, into the world of shadows. Swimming through the kingdom, he is finally free. And the kingdom itself, some weird, abstract 2D only world that bends and has corners in the 3D space as well. From the footage, it looks like we'd have a further world introduction sequence for the Shadow Realm, with gags such as a dog's shadow moaning about his caster drinking from the toilet,
the most disgusting thing? My caster actually drank out of the toilet.
And a granny talking to a dolphin. Lovely stuff. We also hear in the footage a tannoy saying shadows from Sector 43.
Shadows now arriving from Sector 43.
Implying there's some kind of society and infrastructure to this shadow world as well. However, shortly after this, we get a first appearance of Daniel's love interest, Heidi, voiced by Kate Hudson. That's the most standard sounding part of the plot, particularly as she's even referred to as the love interest. Not to mention that concept art of her leaning over the table, although it does give us insight into Daniel's more timid qualities. The first meeting of the two seems to take place after Daniel's day at work, checking the mailbox for his apartment.
That's you. You're Heidi. I just wanted you to remember that I knew that.
As we can see, Dan's being his fearful, adorable self, which probably wins him a date of sorts despite all of the odds. Being entranced by Heidi's adventurous personality and affinity for photography and skydiving. How very action hero-y. We can also see that his shadow is always there, even when just adhering to his movements, which is an interesting detail. If you think how difficult incorporating shadows in animation must be in the first place, try having them there for the entire movie using a completely different style of animation. DreamWorks certainly didn't, seeing as they cancelled the movie. And in some sort of form, we know that eventually Daniel gets home and has his first proper encounter with Dan.
Who's there?
But here's likely how it goes. After having the conversation with Heidi, she ends up leaving behind her camera, and in trying to return Heidi's camera, which she had forgotten during the last scene, from the footage, this appears to begin with Dan starting to demonstrate that he can control Daniel prior to Daniel becoming aware that his shadow's a whole separate person. Dan wants to brazenly ring the doorbell, whereas Daniel wants to keep as meek as possible in returning the camera. But with Dan commandeering Daniel's hand for the very first time, all hell breaks loose. Cue my favorite clip of Dan diving into water whilst Daniel face plants the floor. I'm a sucker for comedy violence, and slapstick was apparently in the central DNA of this movie. I mean, judging by the clip, you can see that the shadows have the powers of cartoon characters akin to Roger Rabbit, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that Roger Rabbit was a big inspiration for combining CGI and traditional animation in the way that this movie was going to. I think slapstick also just looks better in traditional animation, so it's definitely utilizing the use of it in a way that I really appreciate. Particularly when you're trying to contrast a restrained character with an expressive version of himself. Having that opposite character free of real-world rules and logic really helps sell that core duality. As we see in another more proof-of-concept clip,
Come on, don't you want to be a hero?
Shadow Dan has the ability to entirely morph and change his body structure to be more manly and muscular. There's all sorts of character clips that we're not really going to be mentioning in this chronological story stitching, but perhaps it will be sprinkled generally around this whole video so you can see a little bit of just the characters and how they move and work, irrelevant to the main plotline as it is. Indeed, from this sequence we would have quickly learned that Dan and Daniel are two opposites who share the same shape.
That didn't just happen. That did not just happen. That did not just happen.
I think it did.
Ow! Whoa! Who's that?
Something which I can see casting two different voice actors would have helped hammer home. Although it is a little bit confusing that one's Dan and the other's Daniel. Personally, I think the name should have been more diverse, because even me mentioning them both quickly in a sentence sometimes makes me double take on which one I'm talking about. Unlike the overly cautious and timid Daniel, Dan is a much more chaotic and excitable kind of character. He's free-spirited, zany, everything Daniel isn't. In some test footage, we even see the transition from Dan mirroring Daniel to being himself. I get the impression from some of this animation that we get a fair bit of Dan screwing around with Daniel before Daniel gets any context about what's actually going on, which eventually leads us to the lamp scene. Hey there, thank you for making it to the halfway mark of this video. Do come along and subscribe if you're liking more content like this. I'm probably going to revisit this project again in another year, and if you want to hear more things me and my shadow, we've made 2 previous videos on it. Enjoy. Which eventually leads us to the lamp scene, my other favorite, where he seems to come face to face with Dan, but also in a dynamically moving, well choreographed and directorial prowess kind of way.
Wait, Daniel. You just have to stop. Daniel, stop. Wait, Daniel. You just have to.
Okay, you know what? Let me just try this.
No, wait. No, wait.
I've said before how much I love the concept of this scene, Dan's shape having to morph in accordance to Daniel moving the lamp around. We could see at this point they're having some form of a conversation, potentially just Dan explaining who he is in the entire shadow world. It's a lot to learn very quickly, and something that is apparently forbidden. However, Daniel isn't taking in the revelation that his shadow's a completely different person well, with multiple sequences of them arguing around the apartment. Daniel seeming to be in denial about the whole situation.
That's a crazy dream. What are we laughing about?
No, what?
Oh, no! Daniel!
I'm dreaming.
Was it that dream when you were 6? Where you're flying, but you're real?
My
Shadow! I know! I can't go away. I'm your shadow. Daniel, listen, this is a good thing. Trust me. I can help you. That's what shadows do. Not just your shadow.
Is this normal? I mean, do other shadows talk with their people?
From here, we see Daniel arrive at Roberto's Pizza Paisano.
Hey, look, there's a seat at the counter.
The main cook being a guy called Roberto, of course. Here we see Dan interacting with other shadows as well as continuing to talk to Daniel. As we'll soon learn why, I wonder if it's significant that we don't see Roberto's shadow in this scene. I mean, we can see the shadows of the police officer and the firefighter, Big Charles, in the footage, but Roberto's shadow is completely obscured. Conversation-wise, Daniel is struggling to put together an order, and as Shadow Dan continues to commandeer the situation, the police officer only gets more frustrated.
What do you want?
Tea, please, just tea with ginger, okay?
Look at you, mingling. Psst, Big Charles.
But once the other two talking characters leave the shop, inevitably, Haiti then turns up, as we saw also in that earlier concept art.
Won't just be cool. No, tough. Be tough and cool.
Ow! Ow! Hi!
Hi!
Ow! Hi, Dee!
And don't talk about your sinuses.
We don't have much context for what then happens, but the outcome is that Dan somehow manages to get Daniel to agree to go skydiving with Haiti, again giving out bombastic conversational advice. Whatever went down there, post-skydiving agreement, I'm gonna drop some of the more recent footage to spill out in the form of a storyboard. You see, I was kind of confused about what might have happened between this daytime scene and Daniel looking exhausted, going to bed wearing a rubber ducky hoop. There's clearly some stuff that happened in between, and so I'm going with he went to his job and had Dan messing around with Daniel the whole time. After all, the police officer and firefighter were there in full uniform, so presumably must either be there for breakfast or for lunch. And so post-Haiti encounter, Dan returns to the shadow world, now energized by the revelation that Daniel can seemingly now interact with people and do bold things, such as skydiving with Haiti.
Oh, this is it, buddy. It's finally happening. He's changing my life. I mean, his life. He's gonna go skydiving. If he could talk to Heidi, then maybe he could talk to other people and go to cafes and play sports and even fist bump. Oh, my. Or he could be a fireman or a cowboy or a robot.
The subsequent sequence shows Daniel trying to get on with his day at work, but Dan disrupts, possibly excited by this new development. What unfolds is a whole sequence I haven't seen before, involving Daniel tumbling out of the office and being dragged home by Dan. In the excitable shadow world scene, he mentioned other jobs that Daniel could now go after, so from the limited information we have, I'm assuming this sequence is essentially Dan getting Daniel to walk away from his old job. This sequence includes controlling Daniel on his motorcycle, which will come back into action later, leading to Daniel crawling into bed and saying,
You have to stop this. You and all your shadow friends. Somebody's gonna get hurt.
You worry too much. A shadow's job is to protect. There's no way a shadow would ever hurt a caster.
However, we do apparently have some more information about the Gap in this part of the story, it's just not so much shown in footage. See, supposedly, Daniel is to be chased by a scurry of scissor-wielding chipmunks, fleeing across rooftops, through swimming pools and the like, before eventually realizing that the chipmunks themselves are being controlled by their shadows. Obviously, not putting together a very good look from Daniel's perspective on the behavior of all shadows, hence the line we just got to,
You have to stop this. You and all your shadow friends.
Whatever the case, this is the point where Dan tells Daniel that a shadow would never harm its caster, perhaps raising the sentiment after humiliating Daniel in the previous scene, and establishing the fact that this is a rule in this shadowy reality. Wow, wonder if that core rule will backfire. And that explains the chipmunks, as apparently the villain Mac had convinced these shadows in the shadow world that their casters were trying to abandon their shadows. And this lie is what sets up all of the other conflicts with shadows in this movie. And conflict is exactly what in the next scene happens next, as Daniel goes to bed and switches off the light. Finally, Shadow Dan doesn't have to stick around as Daniel checks light bulbs for hours on end or something. However, in his excitable tomfoolery over in the Shadow Realm, it all gets interrupted when he spots Shadow Roberto. And from the sounds of this clip, what he's seeing ain't too good.
Roberto?
From footage, we have actual Roberto being controlled by the villain. So presumably, Shadow Roberto is either just displaced or going even darker, maybe. But Dan certainly sees something, and he subsequently tries to tell Daniel about it and the mysterious evil shadow. However, unfortunately for him, he clearly rubbed Daniel the wrong way last time with whatever that whole rubber ducky incident was.
Oh, hey, it's about time. Listen, Daniel, I need to talk to you.
Uh-huh.
There's this evil shadow.
Uh-huh.
And he's been... Oh, that's not funny, man!
So swiftly, Daniel sends him back to the shadow world by turning the lights off, creating that classic miscommunication of not communicating thanks to the quarrels of the day. Again, more Roger Rabbit vibes, very much reminding me of the Roger and Eddie Valiant dynamic in a way. Not to mention the mystery caper angle to this. Instead of Toontown, we have the Shadow World. And in the Shadow World, now Mac is aware of Shadow Dan, stalking him in this realm and revealing himself and his ideals to the guy. Not that it quite translates though. Evil guy is evil.
Daniel! Daniel? Starting to think you don't want to talk to me.
Later on, evidently getting Daniel back on side, we have Daniel knocking on Hades' apartment door, but no answer. What exactly happens to have Daniel back on side? Who knows? It's another day of antics. There are some murmurings of other scenes that could have happened along the way. Some ideas, of course, being having an actual date with Hades or actually being able to go skydiving. Probably they're one in the same. A date skydiving sounds pretty fun. And so perhaps maybe a date like that going well means that he actually, you know, approves of his shadow slightly for once. Regardless of how he actually spends the day, it then ends up back at the apartment door with no answer.
Go on.
I don't want to go on. Oh, look at you. Ringing her doorbell all on your own.
Heidi? Heidi?
Oh, maybe she's out.
Maybe she's in danger.
Clearly discovering something suspicious, we then have Dan leading Daniel onto the outside of the apartment, which we would have seen through both concept art and footage. But not before attempting to ram down the door with his shoulder like it's good old action idol Jack Shade.
Wow, I've never seen Jack Shade do that. Did it work?
No, it did not.
Unsuccessfully. Limbering out the lobby window over to Hades' apartment it is.
Should we go back?
No, Heidi needs us. We've got to try.
Okay, well, don't look down.
I'm not looking down.
Don't fall.
No, I'm not planning on it.
You might fall if you look down.
This would be where we see things like hanging off of the outside walls of a building. A lot of locations at this apartment complex, it seems. Anyway, sneaking over to Hades' apartment, where she seems to be in some sort of danger, or at least her shadow maybe is. And Shadow Hades is a character we know very little about considering all of this early footage. However, we do actually know who was set to animate them, so they certainly had some sort of plans. Just none of the scenes reached her in production. Anyway, as they come to discover, it's too late and they've both been kidnapped. From love interest to damsel in distress, you gotta feel for Hades here. Is it a more archaic character archetype? Maybe. This, more I think about it, feels like a 90s film. I mean, the fact that they're trying to do traditional animation at all is very 90s. Or at best, early 2000s. It's something. I still want it anyway. It's here that they must go on an adventure to go out after the villain and save Hades. The first steps of which seem to be getting on a motorcycle, leading to a big chase sequence. However, either just before or just after this, we also have a scene of Dan and Daniel having a shared flashback to a childhood memory of Daniel wanting to jump off a diving board, but being too scared to do so. And the next footage we have showcases a chase sequence between Dan and the evil shadow, Mac. However, in the human world, this is Daniel riding on a motorcycle behind an old lady, potentially revealing that Mac can project himself as a shadow of multiple people. As things break into a fight between the two shadows, we get this hilarious footage of Daniel punching the air, and whenever Dan gets hit, Daniel getting knocked about uncontrollably. We also see the displaced shadow of this old lady, disgruntled as she lands next to the shadow of a dolphin.
Checkmate.
I actually think this is not necessarily from this, it's just part of the greater establishing shot, but it's food for thought, as everything has a shadow, I guess, though now I'm overthinking the scenarios where dolphins have a shadow. I guess it can only really be in the shadows in super clear water, so these dolphin shadows must be getting a lot of downtime. Unless they're from a SeaWorld dolphin? Sadly, this and the sequence of him controlling Roberto are the only real shots of the villain and later stages of the movie that we have from the footage. The rest is just concept art. I guess that's what happens when a movie's cancelled. The earlier stuff's gonna be more complete than the second half of the movie. However, from the concept art, we can see more creative visuals of the villain interchanging between shadows. We have this cool looking one with him as a pirate emerging in a bedroom, I guess accidentally fulfilling the dreams of the child he's commandeered. And what happens from here is a classic crime-solving caper with a twist as Daniel and his shadow try and solve the mystery. We're gonna be going into some spoilers here for the reveal, so if you want to hold on to the fact that this movie might happen, look away now, I guess. You have been warned. So, later in the movie, Dan and Daniel would have discovered more pieces to the puzzle about the villain. For one, Mac is a rogue shadow after intercepting his own caster years ago with much less amicable end results as Daniel and Shadow Dan. And so, out of fear, his caster has hidden in the darkness ever since, purging his house into darkness, essentially imprisoning Mac to the shadow realm forever. Embracing this freedom, and with a building sense of frustration over the years, he is now plotting a shadow revolt upon the real world, where the shadows are now able to control the movements of the people. Lying to the shadows, Mac has been able to convince them that their casters are going to abandon them, just like Max did to him. And somewhere along the way, he had also garnered the ability to switch with any other shadow he wants. He would have effectively taken control of the shadow world.
Try to take over the world.
The pinky and the brain.
I mean, hey, here's a massive clip of a gigantic, monstrous form of, I presume, Mac, with big tentacles controlling everything in the shadow world. And particularly wanting to target Daniel and Dan, presumably jealous over their inconsequential friendship, the likes he never got to see himself. And all culminating at the town's annual Light Parade, a nighttime parade show with, as you can see from the concept art, plenty of lights and floats with which a shadow revolution would have ample space to tackle the opportunity. Very well thematic to the overall premise, and I can't even imagine how the cinematography would have put that all together. As Daniel and Shadow Dan evade the shadows at the parade, the two would make their way to Mac's caster's house, forcing light into his residence, which finally sends Mac into the real world, where he is able to confront his caster once and for all. Of course, this stitching together has some blips and blobs here and there. We obviously have major gaps in the storyline of what actually fills in every single beat on the in-between. I mean, just speculating, I'm sure as they get closer to fulfilling this plan of mystery solving, we'd probably get an emotional scene of Dan and Daniel being separated, which lines up with all of the classic everything goes wrong beat of being fired, for example. Or who knows, maybe the ability to hop shadows is something that Shadow Dan develops as well, being both good for a power ability and bad for the emotional ability to actually sever yourself from your caster. Or, you know, something like that. That's what my inner narrative algorithm is telling me anyway. The ultimate outcome of this movie would have likely seen Dan and Daniel accepting each other's control of themselves. Or perhaps finding a more accurate middle ground as Daniel learns to break out of his shell and become more confident and action hero-like and more like himself. More like Shadow Dan, since he is simply a casting of his true self after all. However, unless this project gets revamped, we'll simply never truly know. You know how Woody feels when Woody's Roundup is left on a cliffhanger only to be told the series got cancelled after that? That's the point we're at here with Me and My Shadow. That is all we can gather from the leaked footage, synopsis, and information from people on the production team. Semi-solid information as it all is. You can guess that Heidi is ultimately okay and something happens there. I'd expect there to be all sorts of expansions with her shadow character, but there's of course very little coverage there so far. And the villain is defeated or addressed in some sort of manner, but as for Dan and Daniel, they could go in two directions really. And that's either they embrace incorporating each other within their day-to-day lives, meeting more in the middle and allowing each other to breathe, or they go back to sticking to their own worlds, Whether that be Daniel having his mind wiped for learning the secrets of the Shadow World, or they just choose to, I don't really know. I think it's more likely that the resolution's just them embracing each other, Daniel finally living out the things represented by Dan that he was previously too scared to go for. Maybe the ending scene is the skydiving date with Heidi. However, there is something image-wise about Daniel reflectively looking at his now neutral shadow and giving a bittersweet smile before cutting to the credits. Perhaps we'll find out one day, but for now, I'll round things off there. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Thank you again to the Me and My Shadow Discord server, and of course Squidward15 and Shadis for helping assist in getting some of the finer details of this script put together. And on that note, I shall see you all in a little bit.